Additional comments on capital raising, Part 1. This is Lesson 4 of Class 1. In this lesson, we will review best practices for capital markets advisory, the applications of different capital market solutions. Background. The investment banking community serves a wide array of client mandates that require a diverse set of capital market solutions. Capital market solutions are dependent on the client scenario and a wide set of adjacent circumstances. In this section, the Warren Fox Group will dig deeper into best practices when advising on capital markets deals and review some of the considerations when determining the best path forward. Review of capital markets advisory. Debt capital markets advisory. This is the act of raising debt capital on behalf of a client. Equity capital markets advisory. This is the act of raising equity capital on behalf of a client. Special scenario advisory. There are some client mandates that do not fit perfectly in either bucket, DCM or ECM. Some scenarios require practitioners to come up with creative solutions that satisfy bespoke client needs. Some situations include distress situations, turnaround situations, special situations, or the spin-off or carve-outs of certain business units. Considerations in the capital markets. Regardless of the situation, there are always 3 items that the practitioners need to contemplate when advising clients in the capital markets: deal quantum, deal valuation, and the type of product, that being either capital in the form of equity or capital in the form of debt. Deal quantum, debt deals. Quantum is the amount of capital being raised. When thinking about quantum, the practitioner needs to consider how the size of the product will affect the client. Effects on the operations with respect to debt capital. There are many forms of debt capital that can be raised, and each form of debt brings about its own unique circumstances. Let's consider a traditional term loan that amortizes over a given period of time. Practitioners need to determine the client's optimal leverage position by considering the following. Can the client facilitate interest payments? Are the interest payments cash or non-cash? Will the loan covenants restrict the client's operations and burden future growth? Can the client endure downturns without going bankrupt, such as not being able to meet the interest payment obligations? Is the client at risk of not being able to refinance the debt at maturity? Deal quantum continued. How debt affects capitalization. Creditors are not provided an ownership stake. Therefore, there are no immediate effects on capitalization, but creditors do have first claim on the client's assets and can assume ownership during liquidation. Overall risk and other considerations. Raising debt capital obligates the client to a debt agreement, and this engenders a relationship between the client and the lender. Although lenders do not have an ownership position, lenders can affect influence through the debt agreement. The debt agreement institutes mandatory guidelines around the client's operations. First and foremost, the client must repay the debt. The lender can also enforce other methods of influence as defined in the covenants of the debt agreement. If the client is in violation of the debt agreement, the client technically goes into default. Therefore, deal quantum and the structuring of the deal are important considerations when raising debt capital. Deal quantum, equity deals. The effects on operations. Unlike debt capital, equity capital does not institute a debt agreement with restrictive or mandatory covenants that burden client operations. Rather, equity capital is raised in the exchange for ownership in the company. Therefore, practitioners need to consider how much equity they are providing to the new owners and the potential influence that the new owners could exert on the operations of the business. For example, veto rights. Veto rights, so large owners can demand veto rights to strike down corporate actions. These corporate actions could include dividend distributions, management changes, debt issuance, and potential change of control transactions. Board seats. Large owners can require board seats, which has a direct effect on the company's overall strategy and the company's selection of senior management members. And governance. Large owners can institute certain reporting requirements and operational guidelines that management must follow. Deal quantum continued. Effects on capitalization. Equity investors who provide primary capital receive a newly formed ownership position. By nature, new ownership positions are adversarial to the current equity owners. Therefore, it is in the client's best interest to take the least amount of capital as possible. Remember, the level of dilution is relative to the client's valuation, not the raw dollar amount of the deal quantum. Therefore, practitioners need to suggest a valuation and determine the level of dilution the current owners are willing to accept before advising on deal quantum, overall risk, and other considerations. When raising equity capital, practitioners need to consider minimum amount necessary to satisfy the mandate because equity capital exposes the client's ownership to outside influences. Equity capital is also relatively expensive relative to debt financing. The cost of equity capital is not in the form of debt repayment, rather it is manifested in the form of an opportunity cost. For example, the client is not obligated to make interest payments at X%. Rather, the current owners, or the client, forfeit equity and forgo future return on that equity in exchange for capital funding. Thank you for tuning in, and we will continue the conversation on additional comments on capital raising in part 2, which is the next video.